Welcome back to CrossPolitic. With us today, we're really grateful to have Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh is a writer, speaker, and one of the religious right's most influential young voices. Millions of people read his columns on The Blaze every month, and he has a new book out called The Unholy Trinity.
That's right. Yeah.
Matt, it says here something about alpacas, and you've got to explain that.
Yeah, well, I can't explain that because that would cost you. It's a very high consultancy for my alpaca grooming tips. So I'm afraid
there you go. That's funny because
actually, I can't believe it.
One of Toby's elders owns an alpaca farm, right, Toby?
This is true. Yeah, we have alpacas. So we could quiz you on your alpaca knowledge if we really wanted to.
Well, we could definitely talk shop some other time, sure. Now, it's the bio I'm looking at says actually that you're 27. I don't know if that's true anymore, but you haven't been doing this for too long, and you're a young man. How did you break into this world of political commentary? Yeah, well, unfortunately, I have aged 3 years since that bio was written. I guess I'm 30 now, but still, I guess I certainly have. I guess you could say I'm still somewhat new to this in the last few years or so. And it started for me. Really, you'd have to go back to when I was 20, and I got into radio, and I did radio. At first, it was just rock radio, small time, rock station in Delaware, and I did that. And my goal was to transition into talk radio, so I did kind of a news talk, local, very small market news talk for a few years. And that's when, after 8 years of that, I started a website, started writing, and it really took off relatively quickly, which is, I think, unusual. And pretty soon that became my thing. That's what it did. It sort of took over everything else.
Right. Yeah. Now, you got this new book out, Unholy Trinity. What's that about, and why should people care about it?
Well, it's a book about the three, what I consider to certainly be the three central battlefields, the three primary battlefields of the cultural war, which are life, marriage, and gender. And the Unholy Trinity refers to this kind of three-pronged assault that the left has waged on the culture by trying to redefine human life, marriage, and now, of course, we have to add gender into that. Mm. And this, look, it has seemed obvious to me for a very long time that these three issues are linked, that these are the most important issues from a cultural perspective. And I wish I could say that there were a lot of other books written about this, linking all these issues together, and so I didn't have to write it. But really, as far as I can tell, no one else had really written this book, at least recently. So that's why I wrote it, and that's why I hope some people care about it anyway.
Yeah, and the subtitle says "Blocking the Left's Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender." What is your prescription? How should conservatives and Bible-believing Christians in particular, how are we to block this?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a 10-point plan or something like that, or
yes,
some very practical.
Please.
Yeah, it would be nice. And everybody always asks me that, and it's fairly enough because it is there in the subtitle book. But I think just speaking in broad strokes, we have to first begin by. I know it sounds almost like a cop out to say this, but we have to begin by conservatives and Christians being galvanized and unified around these issues, understanding why these are the important issues, because it just strikes me that we cannot effectively engage the left on these topics, or really any topics, until we, and when I say we, I mean conservatives and Christians, are all on the same page to begin with. And so we're kind of fighting amongst ourselves. We don't have the same priorities. And that's why we're not able to engage the left, because we're not even on the same. And I think if you got 100 conservatives in a room, so-called conservatives, ask them all, what are the most important things facing America, you get like 75 different answers. And I think a lot of people consider that a good thing, and they say, well, that's we're all free thinkers and everything. But it also shows that we don't know what our priorities are. We're not on the same page. And
So it begins at least with that, and that's one of the primary reasons I wrote the book, is to explain to, quote unquote, our side why these issues are important.
So I've probably followed you actually probably for 3 years since your website really took off, and I've always, whenever I read you, I've always benefited greatly from what I've read about you. But I've always seen you've been very articulate and critical, but I've always felt like you've been maybe a little lacking on solutions. You do a great job analyzing kind of this unholy trinity, but then I want to hear like, well, the solution is this, galvanizing conservatives. Well, I mean, every Republican who's run for president has tried to do that. It seems like there has to be something deeper beyond galvanizing conservatives to really take root and change, fundamentally change everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and I know what you're saying, but when people say, well, we need solutions, this is one of the, I think, and it's going to sound strange, but in some ways, it's like, well, let's skip ahead to the solutions. I think that's the wrong approach. That there's not like some, strategy that we can all employ, and everything's better now. That doesn't exist, and anyone who sells it to you is lying. And I've heard a lot of people, well, this is the solution. No, it's not the solution. And I really do believe it begins with how in the world are we supposed to effectively do anything when you have a great many conservatives and Christians who don't even understand that it's important to protect marriage and don't even know what the arguments are in favor of it.
Yeah, right.
They don't even know and now we move on to gender, and you have a lot of conservative Christians are just hands off on this issue. So it doesn't even matter. So I cannot see any way forward unless we first begin by understanding these are it. These are the issues. You need to care about these issues. Yeah. And then once we're on that same page, I think the next solution, which is long term, and again, we're not flipping a switch, but the next quote unquote solution is generational. We lost the culture over the course of generations.
That's right.
And so the real quote unquote solution is when we all raise our kids and our families in this truth, to be warriors for truth. And then maybe over the course of several generations, we can, quote unquote, win back the culture. But if anyone's looking for a solution that's going to take effect in the next 5, 10, 15 years, it doesn't exist.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's right, man. I don't think we got here just in the last 5 or 15 years. Yeah. So their solution definitely can't be a 5 or 15 year answer, right? It's something that's going to start and have to take root in those next 5 or 15 years. But one of the things that I really loved about your book is chapter 8. And this kind of keeps in line with solution and answering the problem. But chapter 8 to me is almost like somewhat of a roadmap, maybe. And I don't know if you wrote that to be that. And chapter 8 is the insanity of transgenderism, right? But the slower title is How Minuscule Minority Bent the Culture to Its Will. And when I read that, I was like, well, like it is a minuscule minority.
Yeah.
And yet they were able to bend the conscious culture, even Christians, to their will, really, to be sympathetic to them. And I'm trying to figure out how did they do that? Explain to me how that minuscule minority culture was able to do something that we're trying to figure out how to do as a larger culture. How did they do that?
Well, I think they began, and that's why, life, marriage, and gender, I have it, I list it that way because I think it also is in order of sort of importance, but also it's chronological that the assault began on redefining human life, and they moved on to marriage, then gender. And I think it had to work that way, that they sort of were preparing the soil, I guess you could say, for this last seed that they planted, and they couldn't have done it. So the quote unquote transgenderism has existed, at least the word or the concept has existed for decades, but it didn't really catch on until after what a lot of conservatives thought was the final thing when liberals won the issue on marriage. It didn't catch on until after that, and I think there was a reason for that, because they'd already established, for one thing, that, listen, human life is relative. Human life is relative to how convenient that life is to those around it. Marriage is relative to your appetites and your desires. And once that's been established, then sure, gender is relative, of course. And the other thing that they had also established on top of relativism is this kind of emotionalism. This whoever's most emotionally invested wins. Whoever feels the strongest is automatically right, and many Christians have been buying into that for a long time, and so I think that's what it came down to. They used a lot of the same arguments they made with King Barons. Look, this is what we want to do. It's what feels right for us, and who are you to tell us that it can't be this? And so they set the stage, I think, that way. And once it was set, it was relatively easy, I think, to move on to this.
But how did they do it as a minority? I mean, why would anybody? How do you take power as a minority when you don't have any power at all? You get to push an agenda to the majority of people who don't agree with you, and yet you're still able to bend. It's like the tail wagging the dog. What was the strategy in that?
Well, listen, they're in the minority on all these issues. Let's remember that.
Yeah.
Gay people are in a vast minority, and even on an issue like abortion, it's a minority of the country, a small minority that feels strongly like we have to be able to kill babies. There's a very small minority of radically pro-abortion people. And most people are sort of in between, to go either way on it. But I think that's how they do it. It's by creating this environment of kind of apathy where they're not going to win you over to their side. Maybe they're not even really trying to. They're not trying to convince you of this. All they're trying to convince you is that you shouldn't care. It doesn't affect you. And if you do care too much, then you're a bigot. And just care, just focus on your own life and your own thing. And that's all they have to do is just, with the majority of people, just do your own thing. Don't worry about us. It doesn't affect you. And that, I think, has been the most compelling argument that they've made. That the other things, and this is why I go back to galvanizing, uniting conservatives, because that's an argument that conservatives have not come up with an answer to. On all these issues, they say, doesn't affect you, why you care about it.
Right.
And rarely do I hear any conservative actually answer that question. Usually they'll say, they'll either agree with it or they'll try to move on to another argument. But that's the argument that wins for them every time.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to explain why this stuff matters and why it does affect you and why you should care. And we haven't done that, and I think that's how they've won.
How does transgenderism affect us? So because I think a lot of times is that we hear this and then it's like, okay, how do we respond back to them when they're saying, no, listen, Matt, it doesn't affect you. I just want to be this way. What is me being this way? How is that going to hurt you in any kind of way, right? And you say,
well, I would say two things. The first is, it affects me the same way that if you tried to say, hey, we're going to come up with a new system of geometry and we're going to start calling circles triangles from now on. And it doesn't, just let us do it. This is what we want to do. Just leave us alone. We're going to call circles triangles. And for the most part, I could go about my day and go to the store and live my life. And the fact that circles or triangles really wouldn't necessarily creep up on me. But after a while, it does. It kind of, if you're trying to, for instance, like build buildings with that idea in mind, that's going to be a problem when you don't understand geometry and you're building buildings. And one of these days, I'm going to be in one of those buildings that you built with this new geometry. It might fall on my head, and so then it's going to start to affect me in a real physical kind of way. So I think it begins with it does affect us all, whether or not we live in a culture that understands basic truth. Truth is something we all have a stake in that. We all exist in truth, and so we all have a stake in it, and it's all of our business. The truth is all of our business. And I think if we start to ignore the truth, and on a practical level, at first it won't affect us practically. But then inevitably it always does, because once you start constructing institutions and building your society around these falsehoods, eventually that will start to affect you in a real practical way. And so we've seen a lot of falsehoods that they told us wouldn't affect us, have affected us by, the effect that they've had on the family, by breaking down the family, by the school system, by government. All of these institutions are built around these falsehoods. And then they start to affect us in a way that we can't ignore. And so I'd say those, that's kind of how it works.
Yeah. Toby, did you want to jump in on here?
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like back to the question about solutions, and maybe this is what you're getting at, Matt, with galvanizing Christians, is it seems like the minority has successfully shamed Christians.
They got answers, right?
We've become embarrassed. We're embarrassed of the truth. We're embarrassed of Christian morals. We're embarrassed of these things. And so that's how they've successfully maneuvered us. And so we're apologetic. And I was just having lunch a few minutes ago with an Iranian friend of mine. I grew up in Iran, grew up in Islam, is in America now, is not a Christian, but I eat lunch with him, and he knows I'm a Christian pastor, and he says, Toby, you need to tell your people to stop being ashamed. Tell your people to stop being ashamed.
Wow.
And this is a non-Christian guy who grew up in Islam, has completely repudiated Islam, but isn't really particularly religious. And he says, the problem with America, the problem with, all this culture war stuff is, as Christians are ashamed. They've been cowed into being quiet, and you need to tell them to stop being afraid. And I think that's one of the things, Matt, about your writing in particular. You take a lot of flack, I think, for being bold.
Yeah.
And saying it how it is and not really caring if it hurts somebody's feelings. Yep. Do you agree that itself is important? It's not just the message itself, but it's also how we say the message.
Yeah, and well, on the thing you talk about shame, I do think that's a huge part of it. But I also think another part of it, we talked about apathy. I think there are a lot of Christians who aren't ashamed; they just don't care. And
absolutely, yeah.
And not only don't care, but they don't understand. In the discussion, there's also a problem of nobody reads anymore. Nobody has any curiosity, any intellectual curiosity. So a lot of they don't care, and they don't know. You ask the average Christian, oh, why does the Bible say this about marriage? They couldn't tell you. They couldn't even begin to explain why it matters.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think maybe that process begins with shame. People start being ashamed, and eventually they stop caring. And I think one of the reasons why we're so ashamed of our faith in this culture is that we bought into this notion that we've been taught over the course of decades now, that faith we have to compartmentalize it, and it's just an aspect of your life. It's a private aspect, and everyone says, what are the two things you don't talk about in polite company, religion and politics?
Right.
When any interesting person I've ever known, that's like the only thing you ever talk about.
That's right. That's right.
That's really right. You add sports into that, and those are the only three things I ever feel like talking about. But that's what we've been told. These are the private thing, keep it to yourself. And when it used to be different, and and it's not like we lived in a utopia, but when you had when the West was a Christian civilization, faith was just a deep ingrained part of the culture, and your religion was everything about you, and you lived according to it, and society was structured that way. But once you start telling, well, it's a private aspect of your life, it's like what you do in the bedroom kind of thing,
right.
Then that's when people start feeling ashamed. And we're also seeing the weird reversal where your religion is it's like we should treat it like a thing you do in your bedroom and not talk about. But the things you do in your bedroom, now you can talk about that in front of anybody. So
and people need to pay for it.
I think kind of things.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Things.
Yeah. So let me maybe appear to change the topic just for a second. Let's pretend this. Matt, me and you are friends. We go way back now. We go way back 15 minutes all of a sudden. And you're writing. You're talking to the public. You're trying to embolden people. You're being serrated and cutting for a reason. I get that, and I think you're hitting your target for the most part pretty well. But let's say I'm your friend, and I feel like I'm changing. I feel like there's been something burning inside me, and I feel like I'm a black Jamaican person, and that's who I'm.
And he's not, Matt. He's actually really white.
I'm white.
He's
let's
white.
say, hey, man, I'm a black Jamaican person, and you're my friend, Matt.
Don't do that, please. Okay.
But so what do you say to your friend versus what you say in your writings? How do you handle that situation?
Yeah, obviously, I think that's people say that to me all the time. Like, well, would you talk to your friend this way? And no, of course I wouldn't, because it's a different. When you're talking to thousands of people, it's very different than when you're talking to someone one-on-one. You have to adjust your message depending on the environment. Of course, I think that used to be pretty obvious. But if I was talking to a friend if I was talking to a friend who came to me with something like this, I would tell them that the message that I would send, it used to be popular message, is really one of self-acceptance. Like, that's not who you are. This is who you are, and that's a beautiful thing. It's a great thing. You shouldn't it shouldn't bring you any despair, any embarrassment. This desire to be something other than what you are is something that comes from self-hatred, and you shouldn't hate yourself. You should love yourself. So what we're talking about is a message of self-love. And I think that concept of self-love has been way perverted and twisted, to become this kind of selfishness. But there is a truth there that we should love ourselves because we're all created by God. And
I feel like that's where you're kind of getting to, is one of the things you said in your book was we need to get at what truth is in all this. I was watching Hillary Clinton today. She was giving her, Wellesian commencement speech. And she said in her commencement speech that there's an attack on truth. I'm like,
sorry. Yeah,
I'm sorry. Like, if anybody that can't claim there's an attack on truth or thinks that there's an attack on truth, it can't be the Democratic Party. It's like your Unholy Trinity is a good example of this. They are happy to change the definition of marriage. They're happy to
change the definition of life.
They believe the world's 4.6 billion years old. I mean, you go down the list and they just take one untruth after another and swallow it whole. And then it runs down even a farther hill and rolls to the bottom. So I think truth and what God's word has for us in all this is like the solution that gets past our feelings of even, I understand what you're saying about kind of loving yourself, but you can only truly love yourself because Jesus is true and he died for your sins so that you can love him first and then love your neighbor, which obviously includes you. Does that make sense?
Right, exactly. And that's the, if I was asked this question, someone that, transgender, something like that, that would be my message, that you were created by God this way, and it's not like, and there's a unity there. So it's not like your soul is trapped in your body, like it's like your body's some sort of shell, but in fact your body is you as well as your soul. There's a unity, harmony that exists between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And God gave you that, and it's a beautiful thing. And because God gave this to you and made you who you are, that's why you should love yourself. And that's love begins with God, and that's why we should love anyone, including ourselves, because they were created by God, and that's what God wants us to do.
Amen.
And of course, if someone comes to you and they're secular and they don't believe in God, and they come with these questions, then it becomes even more difficult because we're not, and this is one of the problems with living in such a secular culture is that we're not starting from the same starting point at all. So we don't have any common ground the way to connect with each other.
Well, there is a starting point. They just deny it, right? There is a starting point. They just deny it. Like there's
a starting point, but if you're talking to someone who fundamentally denies that starting point, but you're not arguing about the starting point, you're arguing about something further down the road. Well, it's hard to engage with them about the thing further down the road without first starting by arguing over the starting point. But then you've lost sight of that thing. So every argument just becomes an argument over whether or not there's a God, and you can't move on and talk about anything else. But that's sort of inevitably how it works, and. Right.
Which is I guess that's where I'd like to move the debate back there. It's like, well, you can't even say what's right and wrong because you believe in no God. You believe we're just stardust. You believe we're just people fizzing. We're just chemical reactions. So who cares what you think and who cares what I think? It's like the presuppositionalist argument. It's like, let's get to the basis of all this.
Yeah, and that's why I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what's your hope with this book, and what do you think? What do you hope is next? If this takes root, people read this, people are galvanized by this. What would you hope would be the result, and what would you hope would be next following this?
Next, like in the culture, or for me personally?
Running for president.
Both.
Well, my hope with the book is kind of what I've been saying, and I've been very, I've been thrilled, honestly, by a lot of the reaction I've gotten to the book from people who have said, that this book, it stirred me, it made me realize that these are the important issues, and it equipped me to go out there and engage in these things. And I've had a great number of people have told me that, they went into this book not agreeing with me. Maybe calling themselves conservatives, so we have a little bit of agreement, but not agreeing with me on these issues, and they came out agreeing. And so that makes me feel good. But I don't think that this book is going to change the world or anything. It's going to solve all the problems. I'm not claiming that, although I guess if it could change even one person, it has changed the world in some way. As far as what's next in our, I generally, culturally speaking, I try to, although it may not seem like that sometimes, I try to be hopeful, and I am hopeful ultimately, like I talk about at the end of the book, that ultimately we all know, we know what happens in the long run. We know that truth wins and God wins. And so that's where our hope lies, is in that knowledge. But at the same time, we have to balance that with being realistic about where we are right now and where maybe we'll be in the next 10 to 15 years. And I don't see, I think we're on sort of a downward trajectory in our culture, and I do think it will continue. We're on this so-called, the proverbial slippery slope. We're on it.
Yeah, right.
And I don't see anything that's going to stop that slide right now. I think there's some kind of rock bottom we're going to hit as a civilization. I don't know if we're there yet. I don't think we are. Eventually we'll be there. And the question will be, at that point, can we rebuild from there? And as I said, if we're going to, it's going to be a generational struggle that has to begin at home. So that's why I'm always saying to people in my generation, like, get married, have babies. Nobody really says that anymore, but that's one of the reasons I say it, is like, if we're going to win back the culture, we need numbers. So get out there and make some little culture soldiers.
Amen.
The Unholy Trinity by Matt Walsh. Make sure you go to Amazon and pick that up. Matt, thank you for joining us on CrossPolitic. You're a Catholic, right?
I am, that's correct.
Oh, man, next time you come on the show, we're going to have to talk about that, see if we can get you over to our side.
Yeah, Presbyterian, buddy.
Matt Walsh, Unholy Trinity.
Yeah, let's set aside a 4-hour press right now.
Let's do it. And the alpacas. We'll talk about the alpacas, too.
Yeah, right.
Hey, thanks for joining us, Matt.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, guys.